Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Moon Hye-ryeon, filling in for Kim Mok-yeon. Efforts to end the confrontation between the United States and Iran appear to have stalled once again after U.S. President Donald Trump rejected Tehran's latest response to a proposed ceasefire and maritime security agreement. Iran has reportedly dismissed key U.S. demands tied to its nuclear program and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, instead calling for sanctions, relief, war reparations, and full sovereignty over the strategic waterway. At the same time, tensions across the Gulf remain high following new security incidents in and around the strait, including an attack on a South Korean-operated cargo vessel earlier this month. So tonight we'll take a closer look at the escalating U.S.-Iran standoff and what the next moves could mean for the region and beyond. For more on this, we connect with Kim Mok-yeon, a professor at the National Security College at the Korea National Defense University. Thank you for joining us this evening, Professor.
Thank you.
And also with us is Hassan Khan, a visiting professor at the Institute of Middle East Studies at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Good evening, Professor. Welcome back.
Good evening. Thank you.
So to begin, Professor Kim, Iran has now delivered its formal response to the U.S. proposal aimed at ending the conflict, but Trump responded almost immediately by calling it totally unacceptable. So, Professor, how would you assess the current state of negotiations, and how significant is this latest setback?
Yeah, over the weeks, the world community has been waiting for the successful negotiation between Iran and the U.S. But unfortunately, now Iran's suggestion was disagreed by the U.S. and Trump said it is totally unacceptable. So now it's between the two, the possible military conflict are back. And from today, there is no surprise if U.S. attack any Iranian missile site or military complex. So now it's a very difficult situation, and a negotiation process will be a long-term process now. It's not just 1 or 2 months. This will be more long-term negotiation. But to Iran, this is not bad at all, because this anti-U.S. political mood in Iran stopped any kind of political demonstration against the Iranian regime for a while. To the U.S., it is also a midterm election, but at the same time, without any successful nuclear deal with Iran, there is no reason for Trump administration to attack Iran. So now it's kind of the long-term chicken game between the two, and there will be very long term negotiation process between the two. So now in the Korean Peninsula or Japan, other country will suffer from this unstable energy and the oil market surrounding Middle East.
Right, so for now, it looks as though diplomacy appears to remain at somewhat of an impasse. Now, Professor Khan, Iranian state media reports suggest that Tehran's response focused largely on ending the war itself while sidestepping key U.S. demands related to Iran's nuclear program. So, Professor, with both sides still appearing far apart, how realistic is a negotiated breakthrough at this point, and what variables could ultimately shape this outcome?
Well, actually, right now we can see that a comprehensive breakthrough is unlikely at this stage. That the more realistic possibility is a limited ceasefire arrangement that stops the fighting and also reduces the pressure around the Strait of Hormuz, and in order to create a space for later nuclear negotiations. The main obstacle here among these two parts is sequencing. Washington wants the nuclear issues addressed as part of the settlement, but while Tehran wants the war to end first and the nuclear file to be handled later, much later. This is not only a disagreement over content, it is a disagreement over the order of concessions, or who will give what first. So Iran is trying to avoid image of surrender. Meanwhile, Trump needs to show that military pressure has actually produced political results. So therefore, both sides need a formula that allows them to de-escalate this war while not appearing weak or surrendering to the other one. We could see that actually historically, U.S. and Iran diplomacy has worked only when disputes were broken into several stages, not a comprehensive one package. We could see that during the 2015 JCPOA agreement, It was possible because sanction relief and verification and nuclear limits were arranged gradually, not as at once. But we cannot see that nowadays because we are in an environment of militarized and so full of so we cannot have a full deal. It's very harder to have it at once. So the key variables are whether Washington accepts phased negotiations or whether Tehran gives enough language on nuclear issues to keep negotiation alive, or whether security in Hormuz can be restored without humiliating either side.
Right.
So the chance of a grand bargain is low, but there is a good chance of a phased, staged deal.
Right, and as you just said, much now may depend on whether each side is, willing to compromise and, who will make what concessions when. And leading on from your point, Iran also submitted its response after the deadline reportedly set by Washington, leading to some analysts to argue that Tehran may be pursuing a deliberate delay strategy. And what do you think Iran hopes to gain by prolonging the process? And how much influence does Iran's internal political and military power structures have over these negotiations?
Yes, in fact, Iran may be using delay as a bargaining tool. For Tehran, time is not simply a pause, it is a form of leverage. They use it by prolonging this process. Iran can increase pressure on the United States through oil prices or shipping insecurity through Hormuz, or regional uncertainty by attacking the Gulf allies. Or it can also show its domestic audience that it is not accepting U.S. terms under pressure. So there's also the internal political logic inside Iran. Iranian negotiators do not operate independently. The foreign ministry may seek a diplomatic exit, but the Revolutionary Guard and the security apparatus are controlling and influencing the final decision. They have the upper hand. So any agreement must protect Iran's deterrence, nuclear leverage, and regional image. So this makes compromise slow and very cautious. Tehran needs a deal that can be defended domestically inside Iran as a resistance, not retreat. Also, it has to keep their proxy allies or proxy deterrent intact. They have to keep their image in front of those allies. So we could also remember that the tanker war during the Iran-Iraq war, Iran used maritime pressure as leverage, but escalation eventually brought direct confrontation with the United States, so it turned into a very dangerous situation. This history shows both the usefulness and dangers of this strategy. So Iran delay strategy is rational, but risky, very risky. It could improve Tehran's bargaining position only if escalation is controlled.
Right, so as you've said, the internal dynamics inside Iran may just be important as the external pressures ongoing at the present. And so, Professor Kim, meanwhile, the reports of a large oil spill near the Karg Islands, which is one of Iran's most important oil export hubs, it's raised new questions about the impact of the U.S. maritime blockade. And Professor, do you think this, points to growing pressure on Iran's oil storage and export capacity?
Yes, it is definitely pressure. It's great pressure on Iran economy, and some effect on the Iran as a economic sanction and blockade. Then this pressure will be negative impact on the Iran's economy, definitely. But however, this effect will be not becoming a turning point because Iranian people are now all in anti-U.S. mood, and Iranian people want some better negotiation deal against the U.S. Rather than humiliation like the all withdrawal of uranium or complete surrender to the U.S. So Iran has been already under the U.S. sanction over the decade because of this issue, and China and Iran will find other way to trade oil for the midterm. So this impact definitely the negative effect, but at the same time is a very limited effect and will be not becoming a turning point.
Right, and that may make a quick resolution even more difficult. And Professor Kim, turning now to home, South Korea, the government has officially confirmed that the fire aboard the South Korean operated vessel, the HMM Namo in the Strait of Hormuz, was caused by strikes from unidentified airborne objects. And based on the publicly released damage patterns and the nature of the attack, Professor Kim, how do you interpret this incident?
Yes, there is a high possibility that this attack was by Iran, as many people say drone. Thus, the Iraq government now is in very difficult situation because of the Iraq need Iranian partnership for better oil and energy at the market, and the U.S. will restart Operation Freedom anyway, and strongly ask the Iraq to join operation, and the Iraq need anyway at the same time Iran's partnership for the long term for stable and oil energy impact. So the Iraq now is Blue House, National Security Office, Mr. Wissong condemned this type of attack is not acceptable and will investigate who attacked this one and response accordingly. Nonetheless, the Iraq government has very few options at the moment and faces a dilemma situation between the U.S. side military operation participation or a partnership with Iran for the long-term oil and gas cooperation. So it's not easy, and we'll see how the Iraq government will take the response accordingly.
Right, so clearly the incident is, raising concerns well beyond, the region itself. So, going forward, if the South Korean government, were to investigate further and, they were to establish links to weapon systems that were associated with Iran's, Revolutionary Guard, what kind of impact could that have on South Korea-Iran relations and, Seoul's broader Middle East strategy?
Actually, if credible evidence links the HMM Namut attack to IRGC associated weapons, which is very likely actually to be happening because they found out that it's an external attack, not underwater. So the impact on South Korea's-Iran relation would be really serious. But Seoul should respond carefully and only after firm attribution. Attribution matters here. South Korea should not base policy on suspicions only. If such a link is confirmed, the incident would also strengthen U.S. pressure on South Korea to contribute to more effectively to maritime security in the Gulf, like they have been asking over and over. But we could see that Iran, this kind of attack happened to many countries, not only South Korea. It happened to European countries and it happened to Asian countries. So Korea is not a sole country that got attacked. And so Seoul should try to avoid any automatic military response. The best approach is calibrated diplomatic protection of commercial shipping, and limited coordination with the United States and other partners. So the key issue is not ideology. It is the security of civilian vessels and international sea lanes. So South Korea depends heavily on the Middle East energy flows, right? So it cannot ignore threats in the Strait of Hormuz. It should protect its interest, but avoid being dragged into an open-ended confrontation. If IRGC linkage is confirmed, South Korea and Iran relations would become really colder and more difficult.
Right. It looks as though, balancing diplomacy and, security concerns may become quite challenging. And Professor Kim, some observers also argue that the HMM Nammo incident could strengthen pressure from Washington for Seoul, to join a broader maritime security coalition in the region. What realistic policy options does the South Korean government have at this stage?
Yes, a very difficult situation and some dilemma as well. Of course, now Trump administrations will ask the Iraq military to join Operation Freedom, and already said Iran's suggestion is totally unacceptable. So U.S. will naturally restart Operation Freedom, and definitely directly call the Iraq to join this operation by sending Iraq military, including Navy. So Iraq government now has been a hope for peaceful negotiation between the U.S. and Iran, but situation, as you know, will be very long-term process because of disagreement between the U.S. and Iran. So the Iraq government maybe there is no reason to not accept U.S. request for Operation Freedom under this type of a difficult situation and domestic pressure. So U.S. and the ROC maybe will have a more deep discussion, especially now. Defense Minister Lang was in the Washington, D.C. for a talk, and they will have some the possible ROC military the participation in the Operation Freedom. But at the same time, we have to anyway have a diplomatic channel with Iran for the long term, the peaceful energy and oil trade. So now the ROC government has a very difficult situation. But anyway, USS and the ROC military will be responsible accordingly.
Right, so there are several things for policymakers to consider going forward. And as you've just said, Professor, the South Korean Defense Minister An Gu-baek is currently visiting Washington for his first official talks with the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth since taking office. And there is growing speculation that the United States could ask Seoul to expand its military contributions or even consider a deployment linked to security operations around the Strait of Hormuz. Now, how should South Korea balance alliance commitments with the risks of becoming more deeply involved in the conflict?
Yeah, the ROC side always interested more Korean Peninsula issue, like OPCON transfer or nuclear power submarine, as well as possible U.S. DPRK summit. But at the same time, U.S. always looks more global issue like Middle East and not just focusing on the bilateral issue like Korean Peninsula issue. So now, naturally, U.S. will call the ROC military to join Operation Freedom, and especially in the area, the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it's this type of a difference between the U.S. and the ROC regarding vision, interest, and perspective has been a long-term issue. But anyway, this time during the defense summit in Washington, D.C., there will be the more mutual interest between the two. We'll talk about the Middle East issue as well. But anyway, over the decade between the two countries, there has been some gap between the two because of a different interest, different vision, and different perspective for Polish matter. But now is they will try to have a more common issue and common interest, especially for the Middle East.
Right, so managing both alliance expectations and regional risks will be critical. And Professor Kim, ahead of President Trump's visit to Beijing, Washington has also intensified sanctions targeting Chinese companies connected to Iran. And so could the Iran issue become a more prominent source of friction in U.S.-China relations during this upcoming summit?
Yeah, the timing was not fantastic between the U.S. and China leaders to talk about global issues, especially after the Middle East conflict. So as you said earlier, it's a Chinese company is a target of the U.S. sanction because of the Iranian issue. But anyway, between the two countries, Iran will be not just the one issue to talk about. They'll have a more variety of issue as a global leader, including industry and trade and geopolitics. So Chinese leader will call a naturally peaceful diplomatic solution for Middle East or possibly Chinese role for that. But Trump has his own perspective and argument on this issue, and maybe we'll talk about more the bilateral issue on the trade and tariff and other issue. So maybe there'll be some valuable talks, but will be followed by the leg of action ahead. So between the two global leaders, Iran is one of the issue, but it will be not only issue between the two.
Right, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the summit may reveal about these, issues ahead. And, Professor Khan, at the same time, Iran's ambassador to China has, insisted that Beijing is unlikely to shift its position on Tehran despite growing U.S. pressure. And what kind of strategy do you expect China to pursue as tensions between Washington and Tehran continue to unfold?
I don't think that China will abandon Iran totally, but it will also avoid becoming Iran's military protector. So Iran Beijing's strategy will be selective support for Iran. China will may publicly call for a ceasefire, dialogue, and respect for sovereignty. But this will allow Beijing to present itself as a responsible alternative U.S. pressure. At the same time, China will protect its own interests, like stable oil supplies from the Middle East, secure shipping routes like Strait of Hormuz, and continued economic access to Iran. So Iran is useful to China because it complicates the U.S. strategy in the Middle East. But instability in the Strait of Hormuz is also dangerous for China. So Beijing wants Iran strong enough to resist the United States pressure, but not reckless enough to damage global energy flows. So China will likely resist U.S. sanctions pressure, maintain diplomatic support for Tehran, and continue limited economic engagement. In the past, China has actually taken this kind of flexible position between Iran and the United States after the U.S. withdrawal from JCPOA in 2015. Beijing criticized Washington, but adjusted its behavior according to sanction risks. So, therefore, China will not switch sides, but it might quietly encourage Iran to accept the limited concessions and like ceasefire or opening the Strait of Hormuz, in order to keep the interests of the Chinese, the energy and security of the Strait of Hormuz. China's position is not unconditional, of course. Loyalty to Iran is a strategic balancing.
Right, so, regional stability may, partly hinge on how Beijing responds, and, we'll be looking ahead for that. And that concludes our discussion today. Professor Kim, Professor Khan, thank you so much for your insights this evening. We really appreciate it. And that's all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.